Forward Operating Base Kestrel was a digital fortress, and its brain was buried 3 meters beneath the Afghan desert. This brain was a steel box, known as the Smart CP. Inside, the only light came from a wall of screens that painted everything in a pale, sickly glow. The air was cold, recycled, and carried the faint, sharp smell of gun oil. This room was a weapon. It was an eye that saw everything, an ear that heard everything. At 0230, that eye was manned by specialist Mark Harris. Harris trusted Steele. He sat on a stool, his rifle in his lap, wiping down the bolt carrier with a rag. To him, the digital world was just a tool, and a fragile one. The screens were an ocean of information, a flood of static. There was the thermal feed from a drone, showing the world in ghostly white and black. There was the map, tracking friendly units with little blue dots. There was the feed of enemy chatter, a waterfall of text scrolling too fast for any person to actually read. Harris's job wasn't to understand it all. His job was to stay awake and make sure the Smart CP didn't do something stupid. He was the skeptic, the man who believed in what he could hold. His partner was the complete opposite. Private First Class Carlos Cortez sat hunched over the main radio console, staring. Cortez was new, and he was a believer. He believed in God, in omens, and in the small silver cross he wore under his body armor. He wasn't watching the data, he was feeling the room, and the room felt wrong. "You don't feel that, man?" Cortez whispered, his voice barely cutting through the steady vibration of the electronics. Harris didn't look up from his rifle. "Feel what, PFC? The air conditioning? Or is your spidey sense tingling again?" "It's just quiet," Cortez said, his hand going to his chest, his fingers finding the outline of the cross through his uniform. "Too quiet. Like the static is listening." Harris sighed, a puff of annoyed air. He snapped his rifle back together. The heavy metallic noise of the bolt locking into place was the only sharp sound in the room. It was a real sound. "It's a soundproof box, Cortez. That's the point. We have 3 hours and 46 minutes until shift change. Stop trying to find ghosts in the machine and watch your sector." Cortez flinched, turning back to the screens. "Right. Sector. Right." He stared at the drone feed, at the empty, pale white hills. But his eyes were drawn to the one screen Harris ignored, the one monitoring open, unsecured frequencies. It was pure static, a churning sea of digital snow. Cortez leaned closer. He could have sworn he saw a shape moving inside it, something dark just beneath the surface. He blinked, and it was gone. For a full minute, the only sound was the steady, low-frequency vibration of the servers. Then, it happened. It was not a sound from outside. It did not come from the hallway or from the earth above them. It came from inside the system. From every speaker at once, the comms console, the drone audio feed, even the tiny internal speaker on the server rack, a single fraction-second burst of noise. It was impossible. It was a deep, guttural vocalization, a sound that had no place in a digital stream. It was, as the outline described, like a bass-voiced goat. The drone feed audio, which had been silent wind, now registered a spike. The comms log, which tracked all transmissions, showed a corrupted data packet at that exact millisecond. A ghost in the machine. Harris reacted instantly. Damn it. He slammed his fist on the steel desk, his chair scraping backward. Jamming. They're trying to breach the network. He lunged for the signals intelligence console, his fingers flying across the keyboard, searching for the source of an enemy electronic warfare attack. They're getting good. That's a new signal. What is that, some kind of new psychological? He stopped because Cortez wasn't moving. He was frozen. The blood had drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of ash. His breathing was shallow, and his right hand was clamped so tightly over the cross on his chest that his knuckles were white. "Carlos," Harris snapped, his eyes still on the screen. "Report, did you see anything?" Cortez finally spoke, his voice a choked whisper. "That wasn't jamming, man." "Then what was it?" Cortez looked at Harris, his eyes wide with a pure, primal terror. "It's a warning." "My abuela," she said. "She said the devil comes as a goat. That's a bad omen, man." That's a very bad omen." Harris stared at him, his face a mask of contempt. "A bad omen? Are you kidding me? This is a war, Private First Class, not a campfire story. Get your head straight before the XO walks in here." "But it came from everywhere," Cortez insisted, his voice rising. "The drone, the radio. How could they do that?" "It's called spoofing, Cortez. It's what the enemy does." Harris turned back to his console, his anger rising. He hated two things: unexplained data and superstition, and he was currently locked in a steel box with both. Harris was still trying to trace the phantom signal when the room turned red. 10 seconds after the first event, the main power didn't just flicker, it failed. The primary lights died, and the emergency system activated, plunging the CP into a thick, suffocating red glow. Every screen on the wall flashed, not with static, but with a solid, blinding white. Then the sound returned. It was not a glitch, this was a physical force. It didn't come from the speakers, it came from everything. It was a deafening, gut-punching bleat that seemed to originate from inside their own skulls. The server racks vibrated. The laptops on the spare desk, which were powered down, emitted the noise. Harris's own digital watch on his wrist produced the sound at a piercing volume. Cortez screamed and pointed at Harris's M4, which was leaning against the desk. The battery-powered targeting laser attached to its rail was flashing, and from its tiny internal components, the same impossible, deafening cry was pouring into the room. It was a pulse, a wave of energy that had turned every piece of electronics, every circuit, every battery, every wire, into a speaker for its own voice. It lasted 3 full seconds, an eternity of pressure and noise, and then it vanished. The emergency lights still painted the room in red. The screens were black. The only sound was the ringing in their ears, and Cortez, who was on his knees, hyperventilating. Harris was the first one out. He ripped open the heavy soundproof door and plunged into the dark, dusty hallway, his rifle up. "Perimeter! Check the perimeter!" Cortez scrambled after him. They burst from the underground entrance into the cold desert night. Nothing. The FOB was silent, bathed in the dim yellow glow of the perimeter lights. No alarms, no one running, no sign of an attack. Just the distant, idle rumble of the main base generator. They ran back, confused, thundering down the metal steps into the CP, and stopped cold. There was a man in the room. He was standing at the auxiliary terminal, the one they never used. He was thin, wearing a tan flight suit with no rank or insignia, only a small, strange patch of a black polygon. He was holding a white ceramic mug, but not drinking from it. He was just watching the data as the systems rebooted, his face illuminated by the flickering red emergency lights. "Who the hell are you?" Harris demanded, leveling his rifle. The man didn't turn. He looked British. He didn't seem surprised by the noise, the lights, or by 2 soldiers aiming weapons at him. He was completely focused on the screen, which was now showing a complex waveform analysis. This was Keene, the man they'd been told was a liaison, an advisor. He was technical oversight. He worked for one of those R&D groups that didn't technically exist. "Incredible," Keene murmured, his accent precise. He tapped a key. "The resonance spike it's perfect." "I said, who the hell are you?" Harris repeated, stepping closer. Keene finally turned, his expression one of mild annoyance, like a librarian interrupted while reading. "Put that down, specialist. It won't do you any good." He gestured to the screen. "It's active, just as we'd hoped. The old signal is meshing with the new one." He wasn't speaking to them, he was speaking to himself. The CP door burst open, slamming against the interior wall. Lieutenant Price stood in the doorway, a human block of spit-shined boots and pressed flat camouflage. He was the executive officer, a man who lived and died by standard operating procedure. His eyes swept the room, and his face soured. He saw chaos. He saw 2 of his soldiers, Harris and Cortez, breathing hard and looking spooked. He saw the spooked civilian, Keene, tapping away at a console he wasn't authorized to touch. He saw the red emergency lights, the black screens, and a specialist holding a fire axe in the middle of the room. Wait, no. Harris was holding his rifle. Price's mind was already correcting the report he'd have to file. "Report," Price barked, his voice cutting through the tension. Sir, Harris started. We had a signal. It wasn't just on the comms. It was physical. It came from all the electronics. The room was... Price held up a hand, silencing him. A signal? He looked at the main console. I see a power failure. I see a system offline. I see 2 soldiers who look like they've seen a ghost. We heard it, sir, Cortez chimed in, his voice shaking. It was a sound. It was everywhere. Price stared at Cortez. A sound. You heard a sound. He didn't ask Keen. He didn't trust civilians, especially ones without rank. He turned back to Harris. It's called electronic warfare, specialist. The enemy is getting smart. They hit us with an EW pulse, a glitch, and you 2 fell for it. You let them spook you. He pointed to the main server rack. Restart the system. Hard reset. Now, get this CP back online. But sir, Harris tried again. The civilian, he said. I don't care what the advisor said, Price snapped. I care about my CP. Get it done. He looked from Harris to Cortez, his expression one of pure disappointment. And you 2, get a grip. Dismissed. Go get chow. Splash some water on your faces. I'll have the next shift cover until the system is green. Harris and Cortez looked at each other. They weren't just dismissed, they were disbelieved. The one person who was supposed to listen, the chain of command, had failed them. They were alone with this thing. Harris and Cortez were in the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway outside the CP. Cortez was sitting on the floor, his back against the cool steel wall, his head in his hands. Harris was pacing, his anger a cold burn in his chest. A glitch. He called it a glitch. He didn't believe us, Mark. He thought we were crazy. He's a fool, that's what he is, Harris spat. He trusts his procedures more than his own men. Specialist Harris. Harris turned. Keen was leaning in the doorway of the CP, his thin frame silhouetted against the red emergency light still glowing from within. A word, if you please. Not you, PFC, Keen added, nodding at Cortez. You should go to the aid station, get some water. You've had a significant exposure. Cortez looked up, terrified. Exposure? To what? To the signal, Keen said simply. Go. Cortez scrambled to his feet and fled down the hall. Harris turned on Keen, his finger jabbing at the man's chest. You knew what that was, and you let Price walk all over us. What is going on? What's going on, Keen said, his voice low and intense, is that your lieutenant is wrong. That wasn't an enemy attack. It was this place. This place? It's a box under the sand. We built it. No, you didn't, Keen corrected, stepping into the hall. You just built on top of it. This valley, specialist, the specific rock formations, the high-grade iron deposits, the unique magnetic fields. This isn't just a thin place, as the mystics would say. It's a naturally occurring radio antenna, a massive one. Harris stared at him. An antenna? For what? For a signal. A low-frequency, persistent, psychic signal that has been broadcasting from this spot for millennia. Long before there was a base here, long before there was a war, this spot sings. That sound you heard? The goat? Yeah? That's just the carrier wave, Keen said, his eyes distant. It's the dial tone, the baseline for the broadcast. The real problem, specialist, is what you and your army just did. You just built the most sophisticated electronic warfare hub on the planet. Directly on top of the transmitter, Harris felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was worse than an enemy attack. It was something elemental. You're telling me we built a base on a haunted hill? Don't be simplistic, specialist. This isn't a ghost story. Keen's voice was sharp, cutting. Ghosts are memories. This is an active broadcast. We didn't just build a base. We built the world's largest amplifier for a signal that eats minds. Keen leaned closer, his eyes intense. Think of it. All this tech, miles of fiber optic cable, the most sensitive receivers in the world, high-gain transmitters powerful enough to talk to satellites. We've spent $1 billion to create a perfect net to catch This. And it's not a ghost, Harris. It's a sentient frequency. A bleed over from somewhere else. Another dimension, another reality. Who knows? The how doesn't matter. What matters is that it's been broadcasting its consciousness on a level humans could only barely perceive, until now. Harris felt his blood run cold. He thought back to the pulse, the way it forced itself into every circuit, every battery. It just found our network, Keen said, finishing the thought. For the first time, it's not just passively broadcasting. It has a voice, it has access, and it just touched 2 of your operators. Cortez didn't go to the aid station. He ran. He ran past the empty mess hall, past the dark motor pool, until he reached the backup comms shack at the edge of the wire. It was a small, dusty box, a place of last resort. He needed to pray. He needed a quiet place. But the shack wasn't quiet. The single radio rack was humming, part of the same vast network. He sat down, his body shaking. Keen's word, exposure, rattled in his skull. He was contaminated. He felt unclean. He grabbed the headset from the console, not to put it on, but to grip it. He needed to hold something, and his rifle felt too cold. He bowed his head, his thumb tracing his cross. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners. He just wanted silence. But he was a radio operator. The silence of the headset was an unanswered question. He had to know if it was still out there. Slowly, he put the headset on. He was met with the familiar, gentle hiss of the open network, the occasional rhythmic pulse of encrypted data bursts. He let out a breath. It was normal. It was clean. Then, underneath the static, he heard it. A whisper. ... apostrophe ... Los? Cortez's blood turned to ice. He knew the voice. Maria, he breathed. He cranked the volume dial, his hand trembling. The static grew louder, but the voice grew clearer, woven between the digital handshakes of the network. Why did you leave me, Los? It was her, Maria, his girl back home. The guilt hit him like a physical blow, a fist in his gut. The fight they had, the week before he deployed. The $300 he took from their shared bank account, the money for their new apartment. He'd told her it was for extra gear. He'd spent it on a single drunken night with his buddies. He'd never told her. He'd just deployed, leaving her with the lie. No, Cortez whispered, his eyes squeezed shut. No, I was gonna pay it back. You left me, Los. The voice in his ear was heartbreakingly real. It sounded like she was crying. You left me with nothing. Why did you leave me? The thing had found its channel. It had bypassed the firewalls and encryption, and it had found the one signal Cortez couldn't block. His own shame. It was a frequency tuned perfectly to his guilt. He began to rock back and forth in the steel chair, his hands clamped over the earpieces, trapping the voice inside his head. He was praying out loud now, a desperate, weeping babble into the dead microphone. Hail Mary, full of grace. Hail Mary, full of grace. The voice in the headset was soft, patient. He can't hear you, Los, but I can. Cortez stopped praying. He just listened. Harris didn't run. He went back to the CP. He needed to prove it. He sat at the main console, the red emergency light still bathing him in a hellish glow. Price was gone. The room was empty, and Harris was on a hunt. He wasn't looking for ghosts. He was looking for evidence. An enemy signature, a corrupted data packet, a log file. Anything to prove the glitch was a real, tangible attack. He was a skeptic, and his skepticism was his armor. He pulled up the live thermal feed from the north perimeter, the same one he'd been watching before. The world was a familiar landscape of ghostly white-hot and black-cold. He trusted this. Tech didn't lie. It just reported data. He was cross-referencing server logs, his eyes scanning for any anomaly, when a flicker on the thermal feed caught his attention. A new contact. It was a human-sized shape, standing just outside the concertina wire. But it was wrong. It was pitch black, a void. In a world defined by heat, this thing was a vacuum, a cold spot, colder than the surrounding desert, colder than the night air. Harris froze. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. The shape began to walk, parallel to the wire. It had a strange, familiar gait, a slight limp favoring the left leg. No, Harris whispered, his throat tight. It's not. It was the exact limp his younger brother David had walked with for 2 years after a motorcycle crash. The same limp David had on the night he got behind the wheel, drunk, and wrapped his car around an overpass pylon. Harris's grief, the thing he kept locked in a steel box inside his chest, was now walking on his screen. He blinked, a hard, fast snap of his eyelids. The figure was gone. Just the empty, white-hot desert. "Sensor ghost," he said aloud, his voice hollow. A data echo. But his hands were shaking. He had to be sure. He rewound the feed, checking the server's cache. He went back 1 minute, 30 seconds, 10 seconds. Nothing. The server log showed an uninterrupted stream of an empty perimeter. The file, the data, the cold spot. It didn't exist. It had never existed. The thing hadn't hacked the camera. It hadn't hacked the server. It had hacked him. It had bypassed his skepticism by wearing the mask of the one thing he trusted, the technology. The thing was learning. It couldn't find a guilt channel as it had with Cortez, so it had found another. It had found his grief. The thing was no longer just a ghost in the machine. It was the machine. It had graduated from a passive signal to an active, intelligent predator. It was no longer just listening. It was probing. Miles away, a drone pilot, his eyes grainy from a 12-hour shift, was watching a feed of a silent road. For a single frame, a 40th of a second, so fast he'd question if he'd even seen it. The image on his screen was replaced. It wasn't static. It was a high-resolution, full-color photograph of a young woman he'd never seen. Her face streaked with tears. It was Maria. The thing had pulled the image from Cortez's mind and broadcast it to a random operator, just to see if it could. The pilot rubbed his eyes, blaming the exhaustion. Harris, still at his console, was trying to find the source of the cold spot when the camp-wide giant voice system crackled. The massive speakers, designed to warn the entire base of a rocket attack, emitted a high-pitched squeal of feedback. But underneath the feedback, for 2 seconds, was the distinct, terrifying sound of a high-speed collision. It was metal on concrete, the shattering of a windshield. It was the precise sound of David's crash, pulled from the deepest, most guarded file in Harris's memory. An instant later, the base-wide system clicked off. The "all clear" tone sounded. An automated voice announced, "Apologies. Feedback in the system. It was a test." The thing was no longer just haunting them. It was probing the entire network. It was knocking on every digital door, checking every lock, and looking for more cracks. It was searching for more sinners, more grief. It was hungry, and it was learning. Cortez was gone. The weeping, terrified private was just a shell. Something else was looking out of his eyes. He wasn't just possessed, he was being recoded. He was in the main comms hub, the primary radio room for the entire FOB. The door was locked. He was working with a speed and precision he didn't possess, his hands moving with alien certainty. He had ripped open the main transmitter console, exposing its complex guts. Using a soldering iron from a toolkit, he was physically welding new components onto the motherboard, bridging connections that should never be bridged, creating a new, monstrous rig. He was whispering, but not to himself. He was speaking into the high-powered, base-wide microphone. "I am the sin," he whispered, his voice no longer his own. It was layered, carrying the same deep, guttural resonance as the goat signal. "I am the new sin. I am the word. I am the truth that was buried." The words of his confession to Maria had been twisted. The guilt was gone, replaced by a cold, terrible purpose. The thing had used his guilt as a doorway, and now it was inside, rewriting his very being. "I will broadcast the truth," he intoned, his hands a blur as he wired the transmitter directly into the main server uplink. He was no longer trying to be forgiven. He was trying to become the new signal. He was building an antenna, not to receive, but to transmit. He was preparing to offer the thing to the world. Chapter 12. The Lockdown. Keene found Harris in the hallway, his face pale and slick with sweat. He was holding a small, rugged tablet, his thumb tracing a rapidly escalating data spike. The giant voice, the thermal feed, It was a test, Harris said, his voice flat. It's probing the whole base. It's finished probing, Specialist, Keene said, his voice grim. It's found what it wants. The main communications hub, it's drawing a massive, unauthorized amount of power. Cortez, Harris breathed. He's not just trying to broadcast locally. That's primitive. Keene's eyes were wide with a terrible, dawning horror as he looked at his screen. He's bypassed the local firewalls. He's accessing the satellite uplink, the high-gain transmitter. Harris didn't understand. Uplink? To who? Command? Keene looked up from the tablet, his face a mask of pure dread. To everyone. He's not sending a message, he's trying to send himself. He's trying to upload the thing, the signal, into the entire US military's global network, the satellites. He's trying to give the GOAT signal access to the whole damn world. Harris and Keene sprinted to the comms hub, skidding to a halt at the heavy steel door. Harris grabbed the handle. It didn't budge. He swiped his keycard. The reader beeped, flashing red. Access denied. "It's locked us out," Harris yelled, slamming his shoulder against the door. It was useless. Keene hammered on the keypad, entering override codes. It's not just locked. It seized the network. The very security systems we use to protect ourselves are now protecting it, Harris finished, his blood running cold. He looked at the small, reinforced window set into the door. Inside, the room was a nightmare. The screens, which should have shown network status, were now active. They showed Harris and Keene's own faces, mirrored back at them from the security camera above the door. But their faces were wrong. They were rotted. Their skin was gray and sloughing off the bone, their eyes hollow, empty sockets. It was a digital death mask. "It's mocking us," Keene whispered, horrified. "We have to breach it," Harris yelled, stepping back. He raised his M4. "No!" Keene grabbed his rifle. "That's a pressurized room. You'll hit the fire suppression system." As if summoned by the words, a deafening hiss erupted from above them in the hallway. The fire suppression nozzles on the ceiling burst to life. But it wasn't water. It wasn't foam. It was a blast of freezing cold gas, a cloud of icy static that instantly filled the corridor, obscuring their vision. The temperature plummeted, but the cold was secondary. The real attack was the sound. The hiss was not just gas. It was a million voices, a chorus of digital screams, all whispering and crying at once. It was the sound of the thing, amplified, weaponized. It clawed at their minds, a physical assault of pure, unfiltered terror. Harris clapped his hands over his ears, but it didn't help, because the sound was inside his head. The static blast stopped as quickly as it began, leaving them in a freezing, fog-filled hallway. The sound of the million voices receded, but left an echo, a ringing in their ears that felt like whispers. It's adapting," Keene coughed, staggering back. "It's using the building's own systems against us." He scrambled to his feet and ran back into the main CP, Harris right behind him. The red emergency lights were still on. Keene dove for his own terminal, the one he'd been using when they first found him. "I can still do this. I can cut the hub off. I can sever its connection to the main network. A digital quarantine." His hands, burned and raw from the freezing gas, flew across the keyboard. He was a man of tech, a digital warrior. This was his battlefield. He typed in strings of code, his eyes locked on the screen, his face a mask of concentration. Come on. I'm in." He was trying to build a firewall, a digital wall to contain the infection. But the thing was the tech now. Keene screamed. A brilliant blue-white arc of electricity erupted from the keyboard, enveloping his hands. The smell of ozone and cooked meat filled the CP. He was thrown backward, his console exploding in a shower of sparks, sending him crashing into the server rack. He landed in a heap, his hands smoking, his body convulsing. No, he gasped, his eyes wide with the horrifying realization. The thing wasn't just in the code. It was the code. Trying to fight it with a program was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. "It's analog, Harris," Keene screamed, his voice raw with pain and despair. He held up his charred, useless hands. "The original signal, the GOAT, it's analog. It's older than all of this. You can't delete it." You can't. You can't." Harris stood frozen, the smell of burnt circuits and seared flesh stinging his nostrils. Keen was on the floor, groaning, his high-tech solution a smoking ruin. "It's analog, Harris. You can't delete it." The words hit Harris with the force of a physical blow. He finally understood. All his life, he had trusted the digital, the verifiable, the data on a screen, and the thing had used that trust as a weapon. It had hacked his skepticism. It had shown him a ghost on a thermal feed, a ghost that left no data trail. Because the attack wasn't on the camera, it was on his mind. It was an analog signal. It didn't care about firewalls or code. It just was. And they had fed it. They had plugged this ancient, primal voice into the most advanced digital network on Earth. He looked at the smoking, high-tech console that Keen had used. Useless. He looked at his M4, leaning against the wall. What good was a bullet against a frequency? He looked through the red-lit chaos of the CP, and his eyes landed on the emergency egress kit. Bolted to the wall was a simple, old-world tool. It had no batteries, no circuits, no network connection. It was just a heavy, balanced piece of steel mounted on a wooden handle. A fire axe. Through the hallway, he could see into the comms hub window. Cortez was standing before the main transmitter, his hand raised, reaching for the final broadcast switch. Harris didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't fight the signal, but he could unplug the amplifier. Harris ripped the fire axe from its mounting on the wall. The heavy, perfectly simple tool felt cold and real in his hands. He ignored Keen's pained gasps and ran back into the freezing, fog-filled hallway. He reached the comms hub door. The small, reinforced window still showed his rotted digital corpse mocking him. "You like tech?" Harris growled, his breath pluming in the icy air. "Try this." He swung the axe. He didn't aim for the window. He aimed for the electronic lock and keypad. The axe bit deep, a spray of sparks and plastic shards erupting as he buried the blade into the wall. The screen showing his dead face flickered and died. He swung again and again, using the pick end of the axe as a hook, and tore the entire console from the wall. The door remained locked. The thing was still in control. "Fine," Harris grunted. He stepped back and aimed for the hinges. He swung with all his strength, a primal yell tearing from his throat. The sound of the axe on the reinforced steel door was deafening, a ringing clang that vibrated up his arms. Inside, he could see Cortez. The PFC had turned, his face a blank mask, and was now flipping the final broadcast switch. "No!" Harris roared. He abandoned the hinges and smashed the small window. Glass exploded. He didn't have time to clear the shards. He swung the axe again and again at the frame, widening the hole, then plunged his shoulder through the opening, cutting himself on the glass. He tumbled into the room, landing on his hands and knees. The sound hit him. It was the goat bleat, but magnified 1,000 times, a physical, bone-rattling pulse that was coming from every speaker, every surface. It was the sound of the thing, moments from its birth into the global network. Cortez was chanting, "I am the word. I am the broadcast." Harris got to his feet. He looked at Cortez, a weeping kid about to end the world. He looked at his M4, still slung on his back. He could shoot him. That would be the SOP solution. But Cortez wasn't the enemy. The signal was. Harris turned from the PFC and raised the axe. He faced the main transmitter rack, the one Cortez had so lovingly rewired. He swung. The axe head, designed to cut through walls, sank deep into the server. A shower of sparks lit the room. The goat sound in his head screamed, a high-pitched, agonizing wail of pain. It was in his teeth, in his sinuses. With every thunk of the axe, the thing fought back, blasting his mind with agony. He swung again, smashing the main console. Screens exploded. He was chopping, not like a soldier, but like a woodsman, severing the digital limbs of the beast. This was a primal, physical fight. It was man versus machine, analog versus digital, skeptic versus the unthinkable. He saw the thick black bundle of fiber optic and power cables running from the rack into the floor, the hub's umbilical cord to the base and the satellites beyond. He raised the axe high and brought it down. He chopped and chopped, the thick rubber and copper resisting, until, with one final desperate swing, he severed the last cable. The silence was instantaneous. It was so total, so fast, that it felt like a physical vacuum. The bone-jarring, mind-tearing bleat didn't fade. It was cut. It was as if the universe's busiest highway had been reduced to zero traffic in a nanosecond. The only sound in the ruined comms hub was the tink, tink, tink of cooling, shattered components and the ragged, desperate sound of Harris's own breathing. He stood there, chest heaving, the heavy axe hanging limply in his hand. The room was dark, lit only by the red emergency lights spilling in from the hallway. Then, a new sound, a small, wet, human sound. Harris turned. Private First Class Cortez, who had been standing at the console like a prophet of a new dark god, had collapsed. He was curled on the floor in a fetal position, his hands over his face. He was weeping. Not the monotone chant of the thing, but the broken, terrified sobs of a 20-year-old kid who was hopelessly lost. "I'm sorry," Cortez cried, his voice muffled by his hands. I don't, Maria, I'm so sorry." The signal was gone, the channel was clear, but the echo of the sin it had used to get in remained. Harris let the fire axe fall. It hit the floor with a heavy, final thud. The door to the comms hub flew open, hitting the wall. Lieutenant Price charged in, his sidearm drawn, expecting an enemy breach. He stopped, his face a mask of disbelief. The scene before him was not a firefight. It was carnage. His eyes, trained to assess a situation in seconds, cataloged the disaster. 1. His multi-million-dollar comms hub was destroyed. Not just damaged, destroyed. Racks were smashed, consoles were dark, and the primary transmitter was in pieces, hacked apart. 2. Private First Class. Cortez was on the floor, curled into a ball, weeping. A psychiatric casualty. 3. The civilian, Keene, was slumped against the wall in the outer hallway, his hands blackened and raw, muttering about an analog signal. 4. Specialist Harris, his face streaked with sweat and grime, was standing in the middle of the room, holding a fire axe. Price holstered his weapon. His mind, which operated strictly on procedures and after-action reports, was already processing. He did not see a paranormal entity. He saw a career-ending incident. He had 2 spooked soldiers, one injured advisor, and one specialist holding the murder weapon for a $10 million piece of government equipment. There was only one possible explanation, one that would fit the report. "My God," Price said, his voice a low growl. He was already writing the story in his head. It was an enemy cyber attack, a massive one. He looked at Harris, who was still breathing hard, the axe heavy in his grip. Price's eyes narrowed. Harris was either the culprit or the hero. Price made his choice. "They must have hit us with a massive power surge," Price declared, his voice full of authority, loud enough for anyone in the hall to hear. "Tried to fry the whole system. Start a fire. Burn the CP to the ground." He walked over and pointed at the severed cables. "Specialist Harris," he said, putting a hand on Harris's shoulder. "You're quick thinking. Using the emergency axe to cut the power feed, you prevented a catastrophic fire. You saved this entire command center." Harris stared at him, numb, his knuckles white on the axe handle. He understood. It was the official story, the only story. The truth was not an option. Price nodded, his face grim. "You're a hero, Specialist. We'll get this all sorted out." The cover-up was instant. It was clean, and it was absolute. The cleanup was as fast and silent as the incident had been violent. Within hours, a new team was flown in from Bagram, men in sterile uniforms with no unit patches. They weren't there to repair. They were there to erase. Private First Class Cortez was the first to go. He was walked to a medevac helicopter, his face pale, his eyes vacant. The official report read, "Acute stress response" and "psychiatric casualty." He was flown to launch stool, and from there, he vanished back into the civilian world, a young man discharged for a breakdown he couldn't explain. Keene vanished even faster. Harris never saw him again. One moment he was being treated by a medic, the next he was gone. There was no record of him ever being on the fob. Men like Keene didn't get debriefed. They were simply moved to a new, listening post, another dark spot on the map where the signal was thin. Harris was the last piece. He was the hero. He was called into a soundproof room. This time, it wasn't a CP. It was an interrogation room. A man who was not Lieutenant Price, a man in a sharp suit who seemed out of place in the desert, slid 2 documents across the table. The first was a commendation, citing his decisive action under extreme pressure and recommending him for a medal. The second was a non-disclosure agreement. It was thick. It mentioned national security, classified electronics, and the severe lifelong penalties for discussing the enemy EW event of that night. Harris looked at the medal recommendation, then at the gag order. He understood. It was a trade, a medal for his silence, a hero story to cover up a nightmare. He picked up the pen and signed. Mark Harris was the ultimate skeptic. He was a civilian now, working in IT for a private data security firm. His new post was a windowless server room in the basement of a glass tower. It was his preferred environment. The air was kept at a steady Arctic temperature, and the only sound was the constant, steady vibration of 24 server racks processing data. It was an ocean of information, and he was its master. He didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't believe in omens or hauntings or sentient frequencies from other dimensions. The human mind was a fragile, organic computer, and under stress, it could malfunction, creating hallucinations. That was his official story. That was the log file he had written for himself. He was troubleshooting a faulty drive on rack 12. The drive was emitting a faint, inconsistent noise, a rhythmic imperfection in the room's steady drone that was grating on his nerves. He needed to isolate it. Harris sat at his terminal, put on his high-fidelity headphones, and routed the server's internal diagnostic audio directly to his ears. The heavy cans sealed out the room, plunging him into a world of pure digital white noise. The familiar, gentle hiss of the hard drive filled his head. He listened, and deep inside the white noise hum of the hard drive, he heard it. It was faint, it was barely perceptible, but it was there. A deep, bass-voiced bleat, cycling in the static. Harris didn't flinch, his expression didn't change. His hand moved to the volume dial on his audio interface. He just turned the volume up, his eyes closing, listening. He was the new custodian.